Okay, I shall speak quietly, but into the mic. It is a pleasure to be here, and I thoroughly enjoyed this morning's session, and I hope that you will enjoy this afternoon's. You already know I'm a psychologist. My research areas are communication disability and intellectual disability, and I am particularly interested in work with families and work in underserved or under-resourced areas. You should all have 3 handouts. One is a set of the slides for today's session. You need the handouts. Okay, got. You'll have the slides for today's session as a handout. You have all the references and some resources, and you have a transcript, which I think we won't have time to use, but is there as an example. So please make sure you have each of those 3. You also have all the information that I'm going to use today on a data stick like this in your bag. So you have the presentation, you have the reference list, you have the critical appraisal tools that we're going to use, and you have the journal articles. But I was fairly sure that people wouldn't sit here with their laptops, so I'm afraid I've killed a lot of trees for today's session. I thought it was important, and I'm reiterating something Professor Forsberg said this morning, which is that quantitative methods are not better than or worse than qualitative methods. The real issue is finding the most appropriate method for the question that you want or you need to answer. So this is not a competition. We're looking at matching questions to methods. This is what I plan to cover today. We're going to explore qualitative research methods and when we would use them. I want to talk a little bit about the advantages and maybe some disadvantages of qualitative methods. I'm going to talk very briefly about data collection, and then I'm going to talk about 4 key methodologies within qualitative methods, and then go into some of the detail of data analysis approaches that are derived from these methodologies. And at various points during that, I'm going to ask you to do some practical activities in order to build up your own research question and your methods. After the coffee break, we'll explore quality, how to ensure quality and rigor in qualitative research. And then, because I couldn't agree more with Professor Forsberg, we're going to look at some critical appraisal tools, and I'm going to ask you in small groups to evaluate some journal articles using one of 3 critical appraisal tools. Part of the reason for doing that is so that you recognize good research when you see it, but the main reason is that we can use these resources to design our own qualitative research at the best level we can. And that's important both ethically, because we wouldn't want to do research that was of poor quality, but also instrumentally, we know that good quality research is more likely to get published. Okay? So that's the pattern of things for today. If you haven't got a handout, please maybe wave your hand and somebody near the front will make sure you get one. Okay, what is qualitative research? No, before I do that actually, how many of you have a lot of experience of either being part of a qualitative research project or doing your own qualitative research? Yep, 1, 2, 3, a small number, okay. Please feel free to chip in. Do take some handouts if you haven't got them. Do feel free to comment and chip in. And if you have a question, or if I'm going too fast, or I use some incomprehensible bit of jargon, please stop me, okay? Psychologists have a terrible reputation for using jargon, so I'm quite comfortable if you stop me. So, what do we mean by qualitative research? maybe not. Qualitative research is an inquiry process. It has its own methodological traditions. So it's not subservient to quantitative research, it's different. And essentially, it's concerned with describing, exploring, and understanding human behavior, particularly from the perspective of the informant, from the perspective of the participant. So it lends itself quite nicely to some of the issues that Karen talked to you about yesterday in terms of collaborative research with stakeholders, for example, parents. And some of the papers that I give you will be more or less informed by that collaborative approach to research. Another key issue about qualitative research is that it doesn't accept that there is a single unified truth out there, an objective reality that we can find. The assumption is that reality is dynamic, it changes, and it's negotiated, so that my reality is not the same as your reality. And it's good to kind of get that out there and accept it. The output from a qualitative piece of research will include at least three things. One is the voices of the participants. So in any piece of qualitative research, you should hear the voice of the participants. It should include the reflexivity of the researcher. If I'm a researcher and you're a researcher, we're going to have some differences in the way that we select, conduct, and report our research, so we have to acknowledge those, but also a complex description and interpretation of the problem, the research question. So that's what qualitative research looks like, or at least should look like. Following on from that, necessarily really, we don't have experimental controls, we don't manipulate the environment. Sampling is often not randomized or stratified, it's often purposive. In other words, I go to select informants because I know that they'll contribute to my research. And in some types of qualitative research, I would deliberately go and select people who I think would disagree with my earlier informants. So it's purposive, it's intentional sampling, it's not randomized. Helpfully, we can use a lot of different forms of data collection. It's quite common to use documents, to use interviews and focus groups and observations, and we can assemble those different forms of data and integrate them. Unlike much of the research that we've considered today, we're not aiming to test a hypothesis. We're usually aiming to develop or explore or further understand a hypothesis. Usually we're doing our research in a natural setting. Of course, you could say to me, what's natural? But I suppose it's not a contrived or a laboratory type setting. They tend to be real world settings. And usually, although I'm going to give you one exception to this, data analysis is inductive. Other words for that would be bottom-up or data-driven. So your analysis is based, grounded in the data, rather than having a framework imposed on it. And what we're looking for is patterns or themes in our data. I've already said that the researcher is active in qualitative research. You're not some neutral person on the sideline who has no impact on the project. And it has its own approaches to rigor, which we'll look at the end of today's session. Well, having said that, why would you do it? Why would we use qualitative research? When is it useful? Really, there are four broad purposes, four broad reasons for doing qualitative research. One is to understand a social phenomenon. So we might want to look at, for example, stigma in relation to people with disabilities. That's quite an intangible issue. So it's to do with attitudes, to do with beliefs, to do with history. And a social phenomenon like stigma would be really quite difficult to evaluate quantitatively. It lends itself very nicely to qualitative research. A second broad area would be to understand people's lived experience and the meaning that they make of it. For example, we might want to do research looking at the way families reconstitute their sense of family when they have a child who's had a traumatic brain injury. So what's the lived experience of being a parent of a child with a brain injury? What's the lived experience of being a child with spina bifida? So how do people make sense, make meaning of their everyday lives? A third approach, or third broad area, is in a process evaluation. So for example, if you were doing a randomized controlled trial, then you might well be doing a parallel process evaluation. So a study that we are seeking to get funded at the moment is looking at the impact of an intervention called intensive interaction. Our evaluation is going to be largely a quantitative piece of work, but we know that we'll need to understand quite a lot of other issues to make sense of our randomized controlled trial. For example, we might want to explore why some of our participants didn't deliver the intervention at the dosage required. We will want to find out why some of our participants didn't complete the intervention through to the end. We will want to find out something about the experience of relatively untrained staff delivering a complex intervention. So to explore the processes that run alongside a large-scale feasibility study or a randomized controlled trial, it's quite common to do a process evaluation which has qualitative components. And following on that theme of mixed methods, there are at least 3 different ways that you might want to combine qualitative work with quantitative. So for example, if you're developing an assessment or a patient-reported outcome measure, you might well want to use qualitative work to help you identify the items that should go into it. For example, at work we've developed an anxiety assessment for people who have the respiratory disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And we didn't feel that any of the existing assessments gave us a comprehensive view, and so a series of qualitative work was undertaken, focus groups, to explore anxiety with people with COPD and their partners, in order then to inform the development of the test. Sometimes it's the other way around. You do a quantitative study, and you think, I'd like to find out a bit more about why people came up with those answers. So you might have quite a complicated survey, which has told you about the time use of parents of children with cerebral palsy. But you want to find out why it is that some parents are spending so much time on, for example, feeding, managing their child's feeding, and other parents seem to spend less. So you want to explore a phenomenon that you've identified in quantitative research in more detail. And sometimes you just want to do it together. So you have a survey that has both open-ended and closed questions. So the closed questions you would be able to analyze quantitatively, but you've complemented that with some qualitative open-ended questions which you can analyze thematically. So from your own fields, and you're a very, very diverse group of people, could you just spend a couple of minutes, either by yourself or talking to the person sitting next to you, and think about whether there is a question somewhere in your own work experience that could be addressed meaningfully in a qualitative way. So it might be a primary how or why question. Why do people do something? How do? What is the experience of having a brain cancer when you're 16? What's the impact on a family of having a child who has a rare genetic syndrome? So are there meaningful primary how and why questions? Or maybe your research is going to be a feasibility study or a randomized controlled trial, but there are process issues that you think would be usefully explored qualitatively. Or maybe your research involves developing a new assessment or outcome measure, in which case identifying concepts or items would be important. So I'm now going to shut up for 2 minutes and let you think about possible research questions. You are allowed to talk, I'm not. Okay, can you just jot down the idea for your question? Just the beginnings of it, just a couple of words, because you're going to pick it up and use that later on. So just make a couple of notes on your question or the person sitting next to you. Okay, perhaps I should have said this first, but let's have a look at some of the advantages. So if I'm going to persuade you that this is worth doing, what are the advantages in childhood neurodisability? I think the biggest advantage, and certainly from my own experience, the most exciting aspect, is that it allows you to explore people's lived experience, their own views. I might have my own views based on 40 years of working in this field, but I don't have the lived experience. So understanding what things are like from an individual's perspective. We did a study looking at augmentative communication, so different types of alternatives to spoken language. And we simply started out our study with each individual parent saying, tell me about a typical day with your child. And just from that initial question, we were then able to explore the implications of parenting a child who isn't using natural speech and who uses and needs to use a range of other media to communicate. A second advantage is that it allows us to operate in real-life settings, to look at real events, real activities. Of course, other types of research do that, but a particular strength, I think, of qualitative research is its natural setting. We also can focus on collecting rich data, and rich data, or thick data, is a term used very often within qualitative research. And it means exactly what it says, finding out a lot about a particular individual's life, or a particular event, or a particular context. That might involve using multiple interviews. It might involve a focus group followed by an interview. It might involve looking at a lot of documentary material. So collecting rich, thick, detailed data. I've already said something about using multiple media, and it's, I think, invaluable to be able to collect different types of data to contribute to my analysis. My particular research interest is children and indeed adults who have profound and multiple intellectual disabilities. And they are a low incidence group. There aren't that many of them. They're also highly heterogeneous. And one of the big problems we have for the research project we're writing at the moment is the availability of our participants. So it's going to be very expensive and very time-consuming to do a randomized controlled trial. If I were to do something qualitative with that group, it would be much easier to find the participants. So where you have very small, very low incidence groups, For example, very rare genetic syndromes. You're really very unlikely to be in a position to do a large-scale quantitative study, but you can do really informative, insightful qualitative work. In qualitative research, we have the potential to mine, to delve into existing textual data or other data. It might be case note data, for example. It could be political documents. So which political party looks as though it has the most to offer families of children with disability? Let's explore their manifestos. Let's cross-check their manifestos against the acts of parliament that they implement when they're in power. Who is it who's really working on behalf of families with children with disability? We can look at the way that disability is portrayed in, for example, children's films, children's literature, in the world of art. I went round the Uffizi Gallery a couple of days ago, 3 days ago, taking photographs where I could find somebody who had a visible disability in the painting. There weren't very many of them, but it was an interesting exercise. So there, quantitatively, I know that there was only one painting out of several, probably 1,000, that was painted by a woman. That was interesting. And there were probably only 10 where there was somebody who had a visible disability. So I've got some quantitative data. Qualitatively, I could tell you what I could see from those pictures. So we can use all sorts of different data sources to explore qualitatively. We can use flexible methods where we have participants who are complex. We have just finished a study which explored fuel poverty in people with disabilities. This was adults, not children. But we know in the UK, where temperatures get reasonably low, that poor people often live in a state of fuel poverty. They can't heat their houses enough for comfort. And we also know that people who have disabilities are more likely than other people to be poor. So we had a mixed method study where we put a sensor in a number of people's houses to look at the temperature range over a number of months. And we worked with 3 adults who have intellectual disability to train them in interviewing. They each then interviewed a number of other people with intellectual disabilities, and we analysed the data together to find out what people felt about the heating in their homes, the temperature in their homes. Yeah. Sorry, I can't hear you. Yes, sorry, if you say it, I'll say it.
Was there a specific reason for having the interviews done by people with intellectual disabilities?
The main reason is that we thought they would be more honest. So it's maybe embarrassing to say that you can't pay to heat your home, but maybe you would be more comfortable to tell that to somebody who you felt something like you. Did you hear that? So the question was, why did we think it was important for people with an intellectual disability to carry out the interviews? And the reason I gave was because we felt people would be more comfortable talking about poverty and less embarrassed if they were talking to other people with an intellectual disability. But the other really was this principle that I know Karen left on here yesterday, that if we're researching the lives of a group of people, we should be doing that with them. So I don't want to go into the detail of it now, but I can later if you want. We also conducted a thematic analysis jointly with the people with intellectual disabilities so that we feel that this was a really collaborative piece of research. Good question though, thank you. Okay, are there any other advantages? Those of you who've done qualitative work before, are there any other reasons why you thought it was better to do that particular study qualitatively? No? Okay, to move on then. I said I'd say a little bit about disadvantages because I think we have to be honest and say that qualitative research generally generates a high volume of data, usually in the form of transcripts or field notes or other documents. The only other type of research I've been involved with that generates that amount of data is systematic reviewing. And if you're involved in either qualitative work or systematic reviews, be prepared to spend hours sitting at a table or somewhere you're comfortable, ploughing through a lot of textual material. So Pope, in a very nice BMJ, British Medical Journal article, says, preparing and analysing these data is time-consuming and labour-intensive. I sometimes think that there is a kind of trade-off. If you're doing a quantitative study, it may take you a long time to collect your data and enter it into whatever statistical analysis you're going to use, but the analysis itself is relatively short. In qualitative research, you may only have 8 or 12 participants. It may not take you very long to collect your data, but it'll take a long time to analyze it. So there are pluses and minuses. I also think that it's fair to say it's harder to get qualitative research published in some high-status journals. And that may be for understandable reasons. One, quite a lot of published qualitative research is not very robust. And you'll come to see some of that when you analyze the journal articles. But also, by its nature, qualitative research is not generalizable to very wide groups of people. And so it's understandable that some very high-status journals, if they had a choice between publishing an in-depth paper that looked at the experience of 12 people and a study which perhaps looked like some of the papers we saw this morning at something that affected the world population, it's a fairly easy question to answer, isn't it? You would go for the topic that you felt had the most impact. So there can be challenges in that respect. But also Pope says to us that the high quality analysis of qualitative data depends on the skill, the vision, and the integrity of the researcher, and it should not be left to the novice. I think it's a bit tough because how are you ever to get started? If you never do it as a novice, you never become an expert. But I guess the answer to that is that you do it with somebody else, that you are, shall we say, apprenticed into being a qualitative researcher. I'm not convinced it's any different for quantitative research. I think any quantitative research I've done has always benefited from me doing it alongside somebody who was more skilled and experienced than I was. Okay, now we come to the components of methodology. Crotty says that methodology is the research design that shapes our choice and use of particular methods and links them to the desired outcome. So it's what am I going to do and how am I going to do it? So we need to think about 5 issues. And this is repetition. You'll have heard me say this already. What's our research question? How are we going to collect our data? How are we going to analyze our data? And data collection and data analysis are probably going to be determined by the methodology that you choose. Reflexivity, in other words, the impact of you on the research, and quality assurance. So we need to keep those in mind when we think about how we're going to design and carry out our research. In terms of data collection, this is not a completely exclusive list. We can, as I've said, use textual or documentary sources, so case notes, films, political documents, acts of parliament, and so on. We can go and collect data ourselves in the form of interviews. And there is a description of interviews that seems to come from so far back that I can't find the source of the reference. And that is that an interview is a conversation with a purpose. And I quite like that, because if you're interviewing somebody, you want them to feel as relaxed as if you were just having a conversation. You don't want them to feel as though they're being interrogated. So it's a conversation, but it has a purpose. They can be highly structured. So sometimes, particularly if you're working in settings where people have limited literacy, you may be doing, in effect, a survey, but as a conversation, because it's not possible for the person to read the text and write the answers. But more often, you would be doing a semi-structured or unstructured interview. Semi-structured interview, you would typically have a topic guide or a set of top-level questions, maybe 4 or 5 questions or topics, with some prompt questions underneath in case you need to follow up. So it shouldn't feel too structured, it should feel natural, it should feel as though people can contribute their answers into this conversation. Unstructured interviews are more challenging. I talk about it in focus groups, but where you have no structure, you have to be prepared for people to tell you about anything. Your research might be on topic A, but if it's an unstructured interview and they want to tell you about B, you have to welcome the topic B and maybe change the focus of your research. And this happened to me when I was involved in some focus groups. We were having focus groups with parents of children who had complex communication needs, and we were trying to ask them about approaches to communicating with their children that they thought were important. But for one particular group of parents, health issues experienced by their sons and daughters were much more important, much more pressing than communication. And however much I tried to gently steer the topic back to communication, they would take it off in the direction of health instead. But the information they gave me was really rich and really powerful and has shaped a lot of my thinking. So focus groups are when you've got really any more than 2 or 3 people. I think they become difficult beyond about 8 people. But you might use a focus group to save time, but more likely you'd use a focus group when you think that different people will give you more interesting information in response to things that other people in the group have said. So if I took you, say 6 of you, you're from very diverse backgrounds, I asked you about almost any topic, the things that one of you said would elicit different comments from different people in the group, and we would have a much richer source of data from that than if it had just been me with one of you. So there are a lot of good reasons for using a focus group. Of course, we might observe, and that could be observing and taking field notes. It could be as a participant observer, so being part of an event. We might use visual images or other artifacts. There's a lovely paper by Hernandez, which is on your data stick, which is to do with using photographs in Mexico. Any other suggestions? I'm sure there are data collection approaches I've forgotten. Other things that you've used? Yeah, very good comment. Yes, you might well want to use blogs, or even, I hate the word, vlogs, so a video blog on YouTube or somewhere like that. And that's becoming increasingly common for people to use internet information in qualitative research. I think there are some ethical issues in that. If you were doing interviews, you would always ask people to complete a consent form to agree to their data being used. If it's a blog, it's more difficult. The British Psychological Society has standard advice. They say that you should always ask permission of the owner of the blog if you can. So if you can, email them and ask and get their consent. But also that you should always keep your social media use for research completely separate from your personal use of social media. So if you were active on that blog yourself as an individual, it wouldn't generally be appropriate for you to use it for research purposes. But yeah, definitely, people do use them. Okay, so maybe think about the type of data collection that suits you. Are you somebody who would prefer to scour through children's novels looking for the way that disability is represented? Are you somebody who would like to go through the current acts of parliament in your country looking for evidence that childhood neurodisability is being funded appropriately? Are you somebody who likes to interview, who feels that they can run a focus group? Are you somebody who's really good with visual image and would like to do your research through visual material? So jot that, add that in. You've got the beginnings of a research idea. Add into that how you think you would collect your data for that topic. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the types of methodological options. I'm only going to cover 4. This is a really messy field. As I've said, I'm going to cover 4. There's a website from Huddersfield University that identifies 26 discrete methodologies, but actually, in my view, there's a lot of overlap. So let's stick with the 4 main approaches for convenience, but I think you'll find that this covers the majority. So broadly, ethnographic approaches, phenomenological approaches, narrative approaches, and grounded theory. What I'm going to do now is go through each of these 4. I'm going to tell you the core principles, the way that you would collect data if you were using this methodology, the way that you would analyze your data, and the kind of output it would generate. And I'm going to do that for each of the 4, and then I'm going to go into each of the 4 in a little bit more detail in terms of how you would do it in practice. So these are, if you like, the principles of using each of them. Ethnography, I think you'll all be familiar with the idea conceptually, but it's to do with describing views, thoughts, feelings of a group, and that could be a social group, a cultural group, or what we might call a subcultural group. So, for example, we interviewed parents who lived in a particular area of northeast Manchester, and we interviewed the speech and language therapists who worked in that specific geographical area. So that's 2 different subcultural groups. Usually in ethnography, you use interviews, focus groups, observations, but you very often use documents and other artifacts as well. In ethnography, we would usually associate this approach with some form of thematic or narrative analysis. In other words, an iterative process of looking for connections within your data. So you read your data through and through and through, and you code it up based on the data, not based on any preconceptions, but very much a bottom-up coding of your data, which allows you to see commonalities that run through and across different data sources. So that what you end up with is either a thematic analysis, where you have a set of themes that pick out the common issues that run through your data, or a narrative account. In other words, what we often call a storified account. So you have an individual's life presented as a kind of package, a narrated package. So you've distilled what might have been maybe 3 45-minute interviews into a pen picture, a narrative account from that person. Sometimes we develop ethnofictions In other words, we bring together the ethnographies of a number of different people and merge them into a fictionalized version that represents each of those people. And sometimes we do this in an auditory way and sometimes a visual way. One of my colleagues has been exploring the experiences of people who've migrated to Manchester in the last 5 years. And he's walked through Manchester with people in conversation with them. And then he's collated their comments about the city and what parts of the city mean to them in a kind of auditory, an auditory landscape, so that you get a picture of the experiences of that person through their own words as a walk through the city. In the same way, it could be visual. We could, for example, ask children who use wheelchairs to take photographs of places that they go. We can discuss those and assemble them into a thematic analysis. So a visual picture, things I like to do, places I like to go, places I don't like to go, people I like to go with, and so on. So we don't have to stick to text. We can do an ethnography with a wide range of data sources. A phenomenological approach, I think in many ways is more subtle, in that we're trying to really understand people's lived experience. We're doing something which is much more interpretive than if you were doing an ethnography. In an ethnography, you tend to take people at face value. You listen to what they say and you document it. In phenomenology, you're trying to understand their sense-making in relation to their experiences. So that, as I think I've already said, you may well be doing in-depth, unstructured or semi-structured interviews, and you may well interview each person multiple times. When you analyze the data, so you're not just analyzing the content, you're analyzing your response to the content, and also you're analyzing the language that people use in their interviews. So you might look for terms that suggest distress through the literature, and the way that people express themselves will convey threads of meaning for the way they're making sense of their experiences. So you comment on the transcript, you look at content, you look at meaning, but you look at how it's presented linguistically, the kind of language that's used, and also you make conceptual notes on what sort of sense this seems to be making. And what you end up with is a set of experiential themes which are trying to illuminate, trying to expose and explore the way that people make sense of their experiences. And typically, you would present the person's experience alongside your own interpretation. And that's why we often use the term the double hermeneutic, because it's not just the person making sense of their own experience, it's the researcher making sense of the individual making sense of their own experience. So it's both in depth in some ways, but also we acknowledge a sense of removal. However much I try to explore and understand your sense-making, it's my interpretation of your sense-making. In a narrative approach, we are trying to, again, explore and describe, The question was to do with selecting participants. I would say in an IPA study, you would usually have a more focused group. For example, I'm trying to remember the ones that I've got here for you. I think making sense of the first year of parenting a child with an acquired brain injury. So you would only be talking to families in that very specific, within that very specific experience. But then some experiences are more widespread. So parenting a child with cerebral palsy, they are a subcultural group, but they're potentially quite a large subcultural group. Whether you would narrow it down and say, I'm going to explore the experience of parenting a child with GMFCS 4 to 5 living in southern Sweden. You might do, and that could well be a very nice IPA study. So yes, I think we would be more focused, but I don't think that's a have to be. Okay? Is it better through this microphone or the other one? Better with this one. Okay, I will try and stand still though for the video, but I'll switch this one off, otherwise we'll get feedback, I think. Is that okay? Yes. Okay, narrative. Much like a phenomenological approach, we would again be looking at quite a tightly defined set of participants. And some narrative studies have very, very small numbers of participants. And the aim here is to develop a personal narrative, to conduct a series of in-depth interviews, often with prompts like a timeline. So you might have a visual, a graphic, which shows from, for example, birth to now, and you plot on that significant time points. So can you tell me what life was like before you got together with your partner? How were things different when you had your first child? Were things similar when you had your second child, the child who has a disability, or in what way were they different? So you might use a visual prompt, but you're trying to get a sense of that person's life story. And the idea behind a narrative approach is that we tend to storify our experiences. And many of you might come from families where you have a whole set of narratives about, and people often say, oh, do you remember the time when? And then there's an often repeated family story about the time your brother lost his shoes on the beach, or the time that somebody fell over, or the time that you went to your grandmother's house and she wasn't there. So people tend to have stories. But there's some work by Nicola Grove, who's a UK speech and language therapist, and she says that families with children with severe disability tend to have fewer stories, which to me feels rather sad. I think that storytelling is part of our collective existence. So in narrative approaches, unlike a phenomenological approach, there tends to be a focus on the structure. We look at episodes and we look at sequencing and we look at progression across time. So transitions, the roles of different people within a family, within a group are very important. And out of that we get personal narratives with plots, with episodes, with transitions that you can explore across participants. So we might, for example, want to explore the experience of families when their children leave formal schooling. And so we might talk to them 6 months and a year after their child has left school and find out how life is for the family at that point. We would then be able to contrast each family's experiences with another family, to look at plots and episodes. Finally, grounded theory, which is a surprisingly commonly used approach to data analysis. I say surprisingly for two reasons. One, I think it's fairly complicated, and the other is because there is this history of infighting between the people who developed it. So it started off being developed by Glaser and Strauss. Glaser and Strauss then had a big public falling out and so there's classic Glaserian grounded theory, and Strauss carried on a different type of grounded theory with somebody called Corbyn. Not Jeremy Corbyn, a different Corbyn. And then Kathy Sharmas came along and said, okay, let's make this a bit more straightforward, and described it's called a pragmatic constructivist approach to grounded theory. So it's complicated, a bit messy, but it seems to be quite popular. And the idea behind a grounded theory is that you develop conceptual categories or theories about social processes. And what you are hoping for, but you won't necessarily get, is an overarching explanatory theory which describes your data. You would generally do interviews. You might also do observation. You always use what's called theoretical sampling. So in a study, not in our field, but I had a student who was looking at both traditional Chinese acupuncturists and Western-trained acupuncturists' views of what they did, what acupuncture was. And after my student had collected a small number of interviews, he then went in search of people with very different views. So he would say to one interviewee, "Can you give me a contact with somebody who's got very different views to yours?" So the idea is to get a very wide-ranging picture of that social phenomenon. Data analysis is very bound up with data collection. So you analyze your first interview, immediately you've done it. And based on analyzing that first interview, you might change the content of the second interview. So you might say, "Another parent told me that they thought the area they lived in was very important to the acceptance of their child. Is that something you've experienced? Can you tell me about the area you live in?" Then another topic might come up in that interview which informs the next interview. So data collection and analysis are conducted concurrently at the same time. And there's a very strict three-step process in the analysis. The first one is open coding, which is line-by-line coding of the concepts found in the data. So you include everything. Everything is coded. You then do your axial coding, where you organize those codes into concepts. You remove them a little bit from the direct quotes, and they become a bit more abstract. You then focus on the main themes that are emerging from that coding and look for this grounded theory which explains your data. And a grounded theory is something which has certain important characteristics. It has fit, in other words, it does explain your data. It has understanding, it enhances your understanding of the data. It has generality in that it actually can be applied beyond, and it has control in that it wraps around the whole of your data. I think I may say a bit more about that later. So those are our four broad approaches. Just to summarize them, ethnographic approach is primarily descriptive, it's thematic, it can include multiple and many sources of data, and typically in an ethnographic approach, the individual experience is subsumed into the group. So when you've conducted your analysis, you're describing a group, not an individual. In a phenomenological approach, the emphasis is on interpretation and meaning making, and individual stories can be retained, so you're not necessarily absorbing everyone into the group. In a narrative approach, you're emphasizing the life story, people telling you about their life experience. You definitely retain individual stories, and you focus on transition points, critical points, and roles. In a grounded theory, you're seeking some kind of explanatory theory for your data, and all the individual data is subsumed into the group. You do purposive sampling, and this is perhaps quite appealing. You don't do any literature review before you start your research. You're supposed to go into the interviews completely naive. Now, I'm not sure that works, but that's the theory. Okay, so with that beginning outline of four broad approaches, reconsider your research question. What type of data are you thinking about collecting? What type of data do you need for your research question? How are you going to collect it? What approach to analysis feels appropriate for you at the moment? And because you've made that decision, what do you think you might use for your methodology? And I guess you are allowed to say, I don't like any of them. Okay, let's now look at each of them in a bit more in practice. I hope I'm not going to repeat myself too much, but I might a little. So thematic analysis is one way of, yes, of course.
You have this, talk about, I don't know the English words, like discourses, maybe?
Discourse analysis.
Yeah, is that a part of any of these? Or is it another? Or?
Another good question. Yes, I could also have included discourse analysis and conversation analysis, and I decided not to because there's too much content anyway for an afternoon, and because I felt that in childhood neurodisability they were less likely to be used. But you're absolutely right. We could also add in discourse analysis and conversation analysis. But it was a strategic decision. There are at least two more approaches. They tend to be used when the focus is much more on language and the conventions of language. And although certainly psychologists and linguists use them, I felt they would be less appropriate for an audience who are more medically oriented. So I do apologize. I could have included them, but I didn't. But all good questions, thank you. So in practice, we'll go for thematic analysis first. This is one of the ways that we would do ethnography. It's, I would say, a nice straightforward approach, particularly if you're relatively new to qualitative work, but it's not to be dismissed. That doesn't mean it's low quality. Always your coding is inductive, it's bottom up, it's driven by the data. You explore your transcript, and I've given everybody a transcript, which is an anonymized transcript from a real piece of research. We don't have time to code it, but you might want to try. And on the back of the transcript is one of the outputs from that piece of research. So you code your transcript, you review your codes until you can identify themes that describe those codes. And it's really important that you use a rigorous and accountable process. There's a really good account by Brown and Clark, which is called something like Qualitative or Thematic Analysis in Psychology, but it's equally applicable to any other research area. But they give you a structured way of approaching analysis. And a couple of the references that you'll look at in the practical part of today's session have used thematic analysis. There's a variation on thematic analysis called thematic network analysis. And again, I've given you a couple of examples of that in the pack of papers. And the nice thing about thematic network analysis is that you get, in effect, a recipe for your data analysis. So I use this with my students a lot, because if they go step 1, step 2, step 3, it's nice and straightforward, it's nice and clear cut, and they end up with things that look a bit like this, where you have in the middle a global theme. Maybe there are 3 broad themes that emerge from the data. Each of those is supported by a number of organizing themes, and each of those organizing themes is supported by basic codes that are close to the content of the transcripts. So the basic things are very like your codes.
there a maximum of codes of basic theme? Maximum, no.
No, because your codes are driven by your data. So there is a lovely concept in qualitative research called saturation. But I think saturation is about as elusive as a unicorn, because you never know if the next person who comes into your interviews is going to tell you something different. So you can never impose a maximum, but what I would say is that when you code your data and then you look for the themes, you should be able to step back a bit from the basic codes and bring them together. So they should coalesce into basic themes. So I think if you have more codes than you can deal with, probably you haven't yet really digested your data. You need to go through it again and see whether the 2 or 3 things in your codes are actually describing the same phenomenon. Does that make sense?
Sorry, I'm a bit unfamiliar with this. So does this whole concept mean that you make one thematic network analysis for all the interviews you've done and all the data you've coded, or is it per interview?
Good question. This would always be across the interviews. So if we're doing a thematic analysis, you lose the individual. This network is made up of everybody who is part of my research. And the same is true of the one on the back of your transcript. That network reflects all the people who were in the study to a greater or lesser degree. So once you do a thematic analysis, you can't take out the individual. You've lost them. Okay? What you would usually have, Attride Sterling says, usually 2, 3, maybe 4 global themes. So we might have, I'm trying to remember from this particular study, one I think was on parenting a child with a disability, one was on the nature of communication, and one was on the social experience and social isolation of parenting. So we had 3 big topics that came out of the research. But for each of those big topics, there's organizing themes that support it, and each of those organizing themes is supported by some basic themes that are really close to the individual data. Is that okay? I will say that I like this approach. It's neat and it's very structured. But you do lose the individual. So in contrast, IPA, as one example of a phenomenological approach, is an approach where you don't lose the individual. And just as our questioner asked earlier, you do aim for a fairly homogeneous sample. So contrast that with grounded theory. So you're looking for a fairly small, fairly common group. I think I've talked about the analysis. You read the text over and over again. It's important with the phenomenological analysis that you also listen to your interviews, because the intonation of your participants is really important. If you read a transcript, you can't tell when somebody was joking, you can't tell when they were crying. So you have to listen to the interviews as part of your analysis. You make notes on the content, you make notes on the language that's used, and then you work from your notes into the themes. And again, there's some examples that we'll look at of a phenomenological approach. I hope you're starting to feel, oh, that feels a bit more like me, or oh, I couldn't imagine myself doing that. So hopefully we're matching you and your question a bit more with the method. Narrative approaches seem to come from one particular source, the work of Elder. And I was surprised, actually, at the extent to which narrative approaches seem to be being used in childhood neurodisability research. And not only with parents or teachers or therapists, but with young people themselves. And there is a study that I've put on your data stick where Halfon has brought together qualitative data with epidemiological research in order to explore both risk and protective factors for a group. That's way beyond what I can possibly cover today, but you might want to read it. It's an interesting approach. I would say all qualitative research requires skilled and sensitive interviewing, but probably narrative approaches more than anything else, because you're taking people back through painful experiences generally and asking them to describe them for you in quite a lot of detail. You need to be somebody who's quite creative, because you're going to storyfy, you're going to bring together in a life story these complex personal narratives. And there are some great examples. I was lucky enough to examine the PhD by Monique Hines, who's one of these papers I'm going to let you look at. And I have to say, it's the only PhD that's made me cry because of the content. Occasionally I've cried for other reasons, but hers was so powerful and so beautifully written in terms of the narratives of older parents of people with autism. So a very powerful approach. Grounded theory, I think I've told you enough about, probably. Constant comparison, in other words, we interview, we analyze, we interview, we analyze, so that there is this cycle of going through our data, and each interview builds cumulatively on the next one. We're moving from codes, so our coding of the data, to concepts, the beginnings of some ideas that underpin the data, to broader categories, to our theory. And I think I've talked about fit, corresponding to real-world data, understanding generality and control. I've got a couple of examples of grounded theory amongst the papers that you've got to look at. Now, I'm going to, I suppose, undermine what I've said so far and tell you that actually there is a qualitative approach that is not inductive, where you can go into your data analysis with a predetermined coding frame. So if you've done your literature review and there are some really clear questions that you want to explore, some very specific things that you want to look at in your data, then you would use something called either a framework analysis or possibly a qualitative content analysis. So in framework analysis, you do your literature review, you look, what do we know about this topic? And then what you want to know is, what can my informants tell me about those issues? So you quite literally have a coding frame where you've got your participants down the side, and you have the predetermined codes along the top. And you read through the analysis, and you look for examples in the narratives, in the interviews, where they've mentioned those issues. If something surprising turns up, of course you can add another code into it, but you start off with your predetermined coding frame. Like a couple of the other approaches, it has a really structured way of analyzing the data. So 5 stages that you work through very systematically. But because of the matrix format, because you've got the codes and you've got the individuals, you can tell your story. In other words, you can present your data both by individual and by code. So you retain the integrity of the individual data. So this is different. It's not inductive coding. It's not bottom-up. You've decided what you're looking for, no surprises, and you've gone in to analyze your data with that coding frame. Right, you'll be relieved to know we're getting fairly close to a coffee break. I want to say, though, before we break, a little bit about reflexivity. Because I think this is something very distinctive about qualitative research. So Malterid says that reflexivity is an attitude of attending systematically to the context of knowledge construction, especially to the effect of the researcher at every step of the research process. So people sometimes criticize qualitative research and say it's subjective. And the answer to that is, yes, to some extent it is. I can't take me out of this study. Because your background, your experience, your profession, your epistemological stance will influence what you choose to research. Why are you all here to research childhood neurodisability instead of researching gambling or drug addiction or mental health in people with dementia? Something about your background, your interests, has led you to choose this area of research. The angle you take, the approach you take to the research also is informed by those factors. The options I've given you for how you go about conducting it is influenced by you. How you engage with your data. Do you prefer to look at it visually? Do you prefer auditorily? One of my students approaches her data by having all her transcripts in front of her, a set of shoe boxes. She cuts her transcripts up into little tiny pieces, and then she codes them by putting them in particular shoe boxes according to the code, because that way she feels very close to her data. It's not what I do. I prefer felt tip pens. I've got 36 different color pens, and I underline and I code my data that way. I engage with my data differently because I like to be able to put two colors under one, whereas once you've cut it up, you can't do that. What do you emphasize in your findings? It would be naive to say that when we analyze our data, we don't put some more emphasis on particular issues. And then how you frame and how you communicate your findings is again determined by, to some extent, you as a researcher. So, would you just spend a moment or two thinking about the aspects of yourself that might affect or influence your research? And then we will go for coffee. So, your age, your gender, ethnicity, in what way might they influence or affect what you've chosen to study? How you go about it? Whether you like the idea of losing the individual in the group, or whether you're very, very keen to retain individual stories. Are you a creative type of person who can storyfy and make sense of rather disparate, fragmented narratives? I'm going to give you a minute to think about that, and then we'll just finish off this slide, I think, and then I'll tell you what we're going to do after the coffee break. Okay, you should, I hope, now have something, even if it's just the sketchy beginnings of an idea, in terms of research questions, methodology. Who is it that you're going to get your data from? Who would be the participants in your study? How are you going to collect your data? What approach to data analysis are you comfortable with? What's the impact of you on this research, so the reflexivity? It's probably a bit unfair to ask you about the expected output, but you perhaps can begin to think about it. So after the break, I'm going to introduce the concept of rigor in qualitative research, and I'm going to do a little bit more talking, I'm afraid, about rigor in qualitative research. And then I'm going to ask you to divide up into 5 groups. And I think I'm right in saying that'll be about 6 people per group. I don't mind if you go to one of the 3 rooms upstairs or outside or down here, that's up to you. But if it's windy, you might need to be inside, because I'm going to ask you to do 2 tasks. One is to spend about 15 minutes discussing your very early ideas for a research, qualitative research question, and discuss them in that group of 5, so you refine them a bit. You can ask each other questions. But I'm going to ask you to spend most of the time, and that's probably going to be about 30 minutes, using one of 2 approaches to quality appraisal that are designed for qualitative research. And I have, for each group, I think it's 11 papers to choose from. And on the top of each paper, it has 2 codes. On the right side, it tells you what kind of methodology. So, for example, GT is grounded theory. And on the left-hand side of the top, it tells you something about the client group. So you can, for example, decide you're going to look at grounded theory with young adults or young people who use augmentative communication, or IPA, and maybe it's a narrative account of children in Palestine with spina bifida. So within your group of 5, I'll ask you to say, definitely pick one. You may get around to a second, but probably not. But have a look through those papers, go to the methodology section or the method section and appraise them. I'll say a bit more about that after the break. Right, I will now stop talking and we can go and have a cup of coffee. Any questions, I suggest you ask me during the coffee break.